Amidst the expansive training mat, Derek Mitchell, a proud black belt with a gleaming belt that seemed to assert his status, suddenly spoke up, his voice echoing through the room as it slowly fell silent. "Hey, Janitor, want to have a quick demonstration?" Derek's unexpected offer, laced with challenge and contempt, shattered the quiet night, making the entire dojo hold its breath. 8 students, those who had stayed after an extended advanced training session, all turned their attention to James Washington. James, a 42-year-old black man with a strong physique hidden beneath a worn janitorial uniform, was meticulously working with his mop. He was new to this gym, having only worked as a cleaner for 3 weeks, and always tried to come in after hours when everyone had left. He sought anonymity, a quiet life away from all the spotlights and attention. But tonight fate seemed to want to pull him back. James stopped his mop, frozen in mid-air. He slowly raised his head, his deep eyes filled with untold stories meeting Derek's mocking gaze. "I bet you've never seen a real fight in your life, have you?" Derek continued, his tone dripping with disdain. James didn't answer. He bent down, continuing to scrub a stubborn stain on the floor, as if it were the most important thing in his life. That stain, more than a physical mark, was a symbol of the past blemishes he had tried so hard to erase. "I don't want to bother you," Sensei James finally spoke, his voice unusually calm, almost devoid of emotion. Derek let out a theatrical laugh, the sound echoing with mockery. "Everyone look, this guy is too scared to step onto the mat." A few chuckles came from the students, but there were also avoiding eyes revealing clear discomfort. What Derek could never have known was that for the past 20 years, James had lived a completely different life. He had tried to forget his true self, to forget the name James "Silent Storm" Washington, a 5-time world champion in mixed martial arts. It had been 20 years since that fateful night, the night he left the ring after a horrifying accident that took the life of his best friend and training partner. It was a secret he buried deep, a secret his teenage daughter didn't even know. "Come on." My friend Derek continued, stepping closer, a permanent, arrogant smile on his face. The same smile he used to intimidate new students. "It's just a small demonstration. I bet you don't even know how to hold a basic defensive stance. Show my students the difference between someone who is trained and someone who just knows how to mop." James felt a familiar sensation rise in his chest. It was like a sleeping muscle awakening after years of inactivity, a fighting instinct that had been buried for too long. He raised his head, his deep eyes meeting Derek's. In that fleeting moment, a strange current ran through the air, causing the martial arts master to instinctively take a step back, his smile slightly freezing. A nameless sense of unease suddenly arose in Derek's heart, though he didn't understand why. "Just an educational demonstration," Derek emphasized, his voice a little strained, trying to hide his sudden insecurity. "Nothing too serious, just to show the new students why they need to respect this martial art." James placed the bucket down on the floor, the soft sound enough to draw every eye. He slowly straightened up. His every move, though seemingly simple, had a strange fluidity, a softness full of inner strength unlike any janitor they had ever known. Around the dojo, the students stopped their training, their curious gazes now mixed with doubt. They sensed something special was about to happen. "All right," James finally spoke, his voice calm and deep, like a lake before a great storm. "But when this is over, you'll apologize to all of them for turning this mat into a circus." Derek laughed loudly, but this time the laughter sounded forced, no longer as confident as before. A flash of confusion crossed his eyes. "Apologize? You'll be the one apologizing to the floor when you fall flat on your face." What none of them knew was that James Washington was once James "Silent Storm" Washington, a 5-time world champion in mixed martial arts. He had retired at the peak of his career after a horrific accident that had taken the life of his best friend and training partner. Since then, he had vowed never to fight again. But some vows are made to be broken, especially when one's dignity is threatened and when injustice has gone too far. Derek adjusted his black belt with a dramatic gesture, clearly relishing every second of the attention. He still believed he was in complete control. "Everyone gather around. You are about to witness a real-life demonstration of why there is a hierarchy in the world of martial arts." James watched as the 8 students formed a semicircle around the mat. Some looked eager for the show, but their eyes still showed a clear sense of skepticism. Others, especially a young Asian woman with her hair pulled back named Sarah Chun, were visibly uncomfortable. She whispered something to her classmate next to her, who just shook his head in disapproval. "Look, everyone." Derek continued, gesturing dramatically. "We have a perfect example of someone who has never understood that there are appropriate places for certain types of people. High-class gyms aren't for well, you know." Derek's words were like daggers to James's heart. He felt a pang in his chest, a familiar feeling he had experienced 20 years ago, hearing similar comments about fighters who didn't look like champions. But now, at the age of 42, he had learned to turn anger into fuel for something much stronger than punches. It was determination, the will to protect his dignity, and a frightening calmness. Sensei Derek Sarah Chun interrupted timidly, her voice barely a whisper. "Maybe we should just continue our regular training. It's late." Derek cut her off, his voice sharp and his face changing. "Sarah Chun, are you questioning my teaching methods? Sit down and watch. You'll learn more in the next 5 minutes than in a whole month of regular training." James noticed how Derek used the girl's full name, a clear display of authority. He also recognized the fear in her eyes. It was the same look he had seen in the mirror 2 decades ago when he woke up in a panic, recalling the accident that had taken the life of Tony Hammer Rodriguez, his best friend and training partner. Tony had died because of him. It was that simple. A series of punches James had thrown with too much force during a sparring session, driven by pressure from the crowd and racist comments. Tony fell, his head hitting the floor at a strange angle, and he never woke up. The investigation concluded it was an accident, but James knew the truth. He had lost control. "Come on," Janitor Derek taunted, trying to draw more attention. "Try to show my students how to hold a basic defensive stance. Or is that too complicated for someone who just pushes a mop all day?" Laughter filled the gym, but this time there were only a few laughs. James remained still, motionless as a bronze statue. His eyes closed for a brief moment, and in that instant he was back on the mat in Las Vegas, hearing the same comments that had led to the tragedy that changed his life forever. "What's the matter?" Scared Derek continued, now circling James like a predator preparing to pounce on its prey. "Or are you just going to stand there like a lamppost, just like you hold that broom all day?" That's when Derek Mitchell made his first fatal mistake. He didn't know that behind the calm exterior, the silent storm was about to awaken, and the educational demonstration he intended to create would become the most humiliating lesson of his life. The arrogant martial arts master Derek Mitchell lightly pushed James's shoulder, a seemingly harmless touch, but one filled with the arrogance of a man who had never faced the real consequences of his actions. He wanted James to fall, to stumble, to see him lose the last bit of his dignity. But James took the push without moving an inch. His feet were planted on the floor like the roots of an ancient oak tree, so stable that it made Derek feel like he had just tried to push a concrete wall. The martial arts master's arrogant smile vanished in an instant, a momentary surprise in his eyes. "Interesting." James muttered, his voice a low growl, as if speaking more to himself than to Derek. "It's been a long time since anyone deliberately provoked me like this." There was something in James's voice that changed the atmosphere. Not a threat or anger, but the terrifying calmness of a person who had walked through the darkest valleys of life and emerged as a completely different version, a version who had learned to control every emotion, turning them into hidden power. Derek, unable to recognize these dangerous signals, continued his verbal assault, trying to regain the upper hand. "Did you all hear that he finds it interesting? Let me show him the difference between thinking and knowing." What Derek didn't know was that every insult, every sneering gesture, was awakening something in James that had been dormant for 2 decades. It wasn't shallow anger or a desire for revenge, but something far more dangerous. A crystal-clear memory of who he really was, with the walls he had built around himself slowly crumbling. Sarah Chun, the young Asian woman with a neatly tied ponytail and the sharp eyes of a master's student in sports psychology, watched the scene with growing unease. She sensed a strange energy radiating from the janitor. There was something in the way James breathed in, the almost imperceptible tensing of his muscles under the uniform, that reminded her of documentaries about big predators on the Discovery Channel. It was the calm before the storm, the terrifying tranquility before the attack. Sarah recognized a strange similarity between James and the elite athletes she had studied, a state of absolute focus, a contained power waiting for the moment to explode. "This is your last chance," Buddy Derek announced, now visibly frustrated by James's lack of a reaction. "Either you accept the demonstration like a man, or I'll call security to have you escorted out. And guess what? You'll lose your job too." He believed this threat would make James submit. James slowly opened his eyes. When his gaze, as deep as an abyss, met Derek's, the sensei felt a chill run down his spine, as if he had just awakened a dragon he thought was just a harmless lizard. That look held no fear, no anger. It was only a deadly stillness, the cold, sharp light of tempered steel. "All right," James finally said, his voice low, but carrying an authority that instantly silenced everyone present. Even Derek had to swallow hard. "But when this is over, I want you to explain to your students why you turned a place of learning into a circus of humiliation." Derek laughed loudly, but this time the sound was laced with anxiety, no longer as confident as before. "Explain. You'll have a lot to explain when you're lying flat on the floor." What neither man knew was that for 20 years, James had not just been running from his past, but had perfected an extraordinary ability to control his emotions. He had transformed the destructive rage of his youth into something more refined and frighteningly effective. A calmness in every situation, the ability to turn all negativity into focused energy. Each new insult only added fuel to a silent power within him, a cold determination his old opponents knew well, but which Derek was about to discover in the worst possible way. Derek adjusted his stance, clearly pleased with the respectful silence that had fallen over the dojo. His 8 students formed a perfect circle around the mat. Some were eager for the show, others were clearly uncomfortable with the situation. "Everyone, you're about to witness a lesson worth more than 6 months of training," Derek declared, dramatically spreading his arms like a stage host. "The difference between those who dedicate their lives to martial arts and those who just, well, mop the floors where real fighters walk." James stood motionless in the center of the mat, but his breathing had changed. It was deeper, more regular, like the steady rhythm of a deep ocean tide. His eyes closed for a moment, and in that instant he was no longer in the gym in Denver. He was back in the Las Vegas National Arena 22 years ago, hearing similar comments from the audience before his World Championship title fight against Victor the Destroyer Petrov. "Look at that black kid," someone in the stands had yelled that distant night, the words echoing in every corner of his mind. "I bet he won't last 3 rounds with a real fighter." James had won by technical knockout in the 2nd round, but that victory had come at a heavy price. The pressure from the racist comments had made him lose control in a subsequent sparring session, leading to the accidental death of Tony Rodriguez. That memory, like a sharp blade, was etched deep into his soul, reminding him of the cost of losing control. "Come on," Janitor Derek taunted, now circling James like a predator. "Try to show my students how you can't hold a basic defensive stance, or is it too complicated for someone who just pushes a mop all day?" That's when Sarah Chun couldn't stay silent any longer. The 22-year-old, a purple belt in jiu-jitsu and a master's student in sports psychology, had spent the last 2 years documenting instances of discrimination in sports for her thesis. What she was witnessing was valuable academic material, but it was also deeply disturbing. She felt a surge of indignation in her chest, a conflict between her role as a researcher and her conscience as a human being. "Sensei Derek." She interrupted firmly, her voice, though small, echoed through the dojo like a warning bell. "May I ask you a question? Why do you think it's necessary to humiliate someone who is just doing his job?" The ensuing silence was deafening. Derek slowly turned to Sarah, his eyes narrowing with a mix of surprise and annoyance, as if she had committed an unforgivable crime. "Excuse me, Sarah, but who is teaching this class?" "You are," she replied calmly, despite her pounding heart. "But that shouldn't include thinly veiled racial insults disguised as a technical demonstration." A few students exchanged anxious glances. No one had ever dared to confront Derek like this before. The sensei felt his face flush with a combination of anger and shame. He, the man who always had control, was being publicly embarrassed by a student. "Racial," Derek repeated, his voice feigning astonishment and outrage. Under the cold fluorescent lights of the dojo, Derek's forced laughter rang out, trying to deny what Sarah had so plainly stated. "This has nothing to do with race. He declared, his tone full of bravado. "It has to do with the respect for martial arts and knowing your place." James Washington slowly opened his eyes. In that moment, his gaze was no longer impassively calm. Instead, it held a deep glimmer kindled by Sarah's courage. There was something about this young woman daring to confront established authority that touched a hidden part of James's soul. He remembered his younger sister, Kesha. She had that same determination, a refusal to silently accept injustice. Kesha had died at 17, the victim of a stray bullet during a confrontation with police in her neighborhood. James was competing in Japan when he got the news. Another loved one lost while he pursued glory in distant arenas, a world of violence and fleeting glamour. That was another reason he had given up everything, fled his past, and disappeared into the simplicity of an anonymous life. Sarah Derrick said, his voice low and dangerous, like a final warning. "If you don't respect my teaching methods, perhaps you should find another dojo. There are places more suited to your mindset." The threat hung in the air like poison, overshadowing Sarah's fragile courage. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine, but she stood her ground. Her gaze was steady, unwavering. "My tuition is paid, Sensei, and I believe everyone here deserves to learn in an environment based on mutual respect, not humiliation." Her voice, though a little shaky, was clear and resolute. That's when James did something no one expected. He began to smile. It wasn't a nervous or submissive smile, but a slow, calculated, knowing grin of a man who had just found a reason to stop hiding. For 20 years, he had carried the weight of guilt for 2 deaths indirectly linked to his fighting world. Now, seeing a brave young woman stand up for the principles of justice he had abandoned decades ago, James Washington began to remember who he really was. He remembered why he had once fought not just for glory, but for fairness. Derek James finally spoke, his voice carrying a quiet authority that made everyone in the room turn toward him instantly. Even Derek paused. "This young lady is right." He took a step forward, his eyes fixed on the sensei. "This isn't about martial arts. This is about you trying to feel important by putting someone else down." Derek spun on his heel, his face red with rage, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "You dare to teach me about martial arts? You don't even know what a dojo is." He snarled, anger clouding his judgment. James took another step, and something in his posture fundamentally changed. His shoulders squared. His chest expanded. His center of gravity lowered almost imperceptibly, and his feet settled into a stance that any veteran fighter would instantly recognize as perfect, a stance full of power, as solid as a stone mountain. It wasn't a learned posture. It was an instinct that had seeped into his bones. Actually, James said calmly, each word clear and deliberate, "I know exactly what a dojo is, and I know this place stopped being one a long time ago." Derek felt an inexplicable chill run down his spine. There was something in the way James moved now, the way he occupied space, that awakened his every self-preservation instinct. He felt unusually small in front of the man standing opposite him, as if he had just come up against an immovable wall. But his wounded pride wouldn't let him back down. "Enough talk," Derek growled, moving into his favorite fighting stance, a familiar posture he had used to dominate countless students. "I'm going to teach you about respect the hard way." Sarah watched the scene with growing anxiety, but also with professional curiosity. She had recorded hundreds of hours of sparring and competition for her research, and there was something about the way the janitor moved that reminded her of the masters she had studied in historical videos. The economy of motion, the perfectly controlled breathing, the calm presence that radiated potential power, the unmistakable signs of a world-class fighter. James closed his eyes for a brief moment and let the muscle memory of 22 years rise to the surface. Every perfected technique, every victory won, every lesson learned from the toughest arenas in the world. They were like an electric current running through his body, awakening every cell, every muscle fiber. When he opened his eyes, Derek was no longer looking at a simple janitor. He was looking directly into the eyes of Silent Storm Washington, the 5-time world mixed martial arts champion. His gaze held no anger or hatred, but a terrifying calmness, an unshakable determination. "Last chance to apologize," James said softly. His voice low, but echoing through the dojo, carrying an undeniable weight. "To her, to your students, and to make this a real place of learning again." Derek laughed loudly, but the sound was full of anxiety and strain. He tried to hide the fear rising in his gut. Apologize. You'll be begging for mercy when you're flat on your back. He didn't know that James had already picked up on all of his technical weaknesses, with just a single glance, the high guard exposing his ribs. The tendency to retreat with his right foot first and the way he telegraphed his punches with small movements in his shoulders. 22 years away from the ring couldn't erase decades of subtle technical analysis skills that had become second nature. Sarah noticed the other students instinctively backing away like wild animals sensing an approaching storm. Something in the room's energy had completely shifted, as if the air had become charged before a bolt of lightning. As they scoffed at Derek's latest taunts, an unexpected expression began to form on James's face. It wasn't anger or a desire for revenge, but the calm determination of a man who had found a worthy reason to break his 2-decade-long vow of silence. Some of the people present were starting to realize that something extraordinary was about to happen even if they didn't fully understand what their eyes were witnessing. Derek settled into his favorite fighting stance, the one he had used to intimidate hundreds of new students over the years. His feet were shoulder-width apart, fists clenched at chest-level weight slightly forward, the classic stance of a martial artist trained in a controlled environment facing predictable opponents. James stood motionless for a few seconds, simply observing. His eyes swept over Derek from head to toe, automatically registering every technical detail. The high guard exposing his ribs, the unstable base compromising his balance, the excessive tension in his shoulders that telegraphed every movement before it began. Silent Storm was back, and this time, nothing could stop him. Derek Mitchell still tried to maintain his arrogant demeanor, bouncing on his feet, taunting James with contemptuous words. "I'm still waiting," he sneered. "Or are you just going to stand there like a lamppost?" That's when James did something no one expected. He began to move. Not a dramatic shift, just a subtle adjustment in his foot position, a slight lowering of his center of gravity, and his shoulders relaxed into a perfect horizontal line. But to anyone who knew how to recognize it, the transformation was instantaneous and terrifying. Sarah Chun felt a shiver run down her spine. In her 2 years of studying sports mechanics, she had analyzed hundreds of hours of video of great fighters, and what she had just witnessed was the transformation from an ordinary man into a born predator. A subtle but devastating change. Interesting, Derek mumbled, his confidence wavering for the first time. There was something in the way James now occupied the space that set off all his self-preservation instincts. James took a step forward, and Derek instinctively stepped back. The action was so unconscious, so primal, that a few of the students noticed. A black belt was retreating from a janitor. The power dynamic in the room had completely shifted. "Is there a problem?" James asked gently, his voice carrying a quiet authority that silenced everyone. Derek felt the blood rush to his face. His reputation was being threatened right in front of his students. He couldn't back down now, even though every cell in his body was screaming for him to stop and apologize. "No problem," Derek replied, forcing himself to manage a strained smile. "Just admiring your stance. Who taught you that YouTube?" The joke fell flat. Not a single laugh. The tension in the room was almost palpable, heavy as the air before a thunderstorm. "Actually," James said calmly, his voice steady, "I learned it in a place called the Las Vegas National Arena. Maybe you've heard of it." Derek frowned. The name sounded familiar, but he couldn't recall the details. "Las Vegas. You went to some kind of weekend training camp there." He was still trying to maintain his superior attitude, finding a way to belittle James's words. Meanwhile, Sarah Chun secretly pulled her phone from her pocket and quickly typed Las Vegas National Arena Martial Arts. What she found made her blood run cold. This wasn't a regular training course. It was a mecca, the place where the greatest MMA champions of the past 3 decades had trained, bled, and fought for glory. A horrifying truth began to unfold before her eyes. Derek James continued, his voice still calm like a final reminder. "Last chance. Apologize to Sarah for questioning her right to speak. Apologize to your students for turning this into a circus. And most of all, apologize to yourself for becoming the kind of person martial arts was supposed to teach you not to be." The offer of grace hung in the air like smoke, fragile but meaningful. Derek could have chosen humility. He could have admitted that he had gone too far. He could have salvaged what little dignity he had left. But instead, his blind pride pushed him over the edge. He attacked, Derek's first punch was a quick, textbook perfect jab. It was the kind of punch that was effective against 99% of the opponents he had sparred with over the years, a perfectly honed move. But James wasn't in that 99%. His movement was so fast, so fluid, that half the people present didn't even realize what had happened. James simply wasn't where Derek's punch was aimed. His body glided to the side like water flowing around a rock without any apparent effort. And suddenly, Derek was off balance, his arm flailing through the air, a look of confusion on his face. "Not bad," James commented softly, back in perfect position and balance, his breathing still even. "Good technique, decent speed, but you telegraphed the punch with your right shoulder." The remark was sharp, precise in every detail, like a slap to Derek's confidence. Derek spun around frantically, trying to locate his opponent. How could a person move so fast? Beginner's luck, he muttered more to himself than to James, trying to shake off the rising confusion. The second attack came immediately. A jab across a hook. 3 punches linked together with the precision of someone who had practiced the combination thousands of times. It was his favorite combination used to end sparring sessions and impress newcomers. Once again, James simply wasn't there. This time, Sarah Chun was quick enough to follow the movement. James lowered his body slightly, letting the jab pass over his head by just a few inches. The cross found only air as he leaned back in a nearly impossible curve. And when Derek threw the hook with all his strength, James took a small step back, causing the punch to miss his chin by mere millimeters. It all happened in a flash, a dance of perfect evasion. An interesting combination, James remarked, still breathing steadily, as if he were just taking a leisurely stroll. Effective against a stationary target, but you left your entire left side wide open. After the missed hook, Derek began to sweat. This wasn't normal. He had thrown thousands of punches in his life, and now he couldn't land a single one on a man who supposedly had no fighting experience. Derek's anger intensified, mixed with a vague sense of fear. "Stop dancing and fight!" Derek yelled, throwing an even more aggressive, completely uncontrolled flurry of punches. That's when James decided the show had gone on long enough. The silent storm was fully awakened. Derek's third attack, a desperate combination of punches and kicks, once again found only air, as if James wasn't really there, but was just an illusion. But this time, something different happened. As Derek stumbled to regain his balance after missing all his strikes, James was suddenly inexplicably closer, as if he had teleported rather than moved. How Derek whispered, his eyes locked on James, realizing he had completely lost control of the distance, a vital element in martial arts. He felt a light panic rise within him. Derek, James said softly now, an arm's length away, his voice calm and authoritative. "You want to know the difference between someone who learns to fight in a gym and someone who learns in professional arenas?" Before Derek could answer, James did something that seemed to defy the laws of physics for everyone present. Without any visible exertion, without any sudden or aggressive movement, he simply placed the palm of his right hand gently on Derek's chest. It was an incredibly soft touch, but the result was astonishing. Derek flew backward. He wasn't pushed or knocked over. He was genuinely sent flying, as if hit by an invisible wave, a force unseen but irresistible. His feet left the ground. He flew nearly 6.5 feet through the air and landed flat on his back with a thud that made everyone in the room gasp. The sound was a dry crack, followed by an absolute suffocating silence. Derek lay on the floor for a few seconds, staring up at the ceiling, trying to process what had just happened. There was no intense pain, just an irresistible force, a dominance from a man operating on a completely different level than anything he had ever known. He felt like a rag doll that had been thrown. "That," Derek mumbled, trying to get up, but his legs were still trembling. "That's impossible." Sarah Chun held her breath, her eyes fixed on James. In her 2 years of studying martial arts, she had never witnessed such a display of controlled and devastating power. There was no brutality, no anger in James's eyes, just the absolute precise application of a technique she had only ever seen in legends and ancient tales of mythical masters. "Actually," James said calmly, extending a hand to help Derek up, a strangely courteous gesture after such an astonishing display. "It's quite simple when you understand leverage timing and energy transfer. Principles I learned over a 22-year professional career." Derek ignored the outstretched hand and got to his feet on his own. his legs still shaking, his arrogance beginning to crack. A 22-year professional career in what he repeated, his voice hoarse. Sarah answered, her voice almost a whisper, unable to believe what she had just found on her phone. "You don't know who he is, do you?" Everyone turned to her, still holding her phone with the search results clearly on the screen. Dozens of articles, photos, and videos confirmed what her intuition had already told her. James Washington, she read aloud, word for word, like a fateful proclamation, also known as Silent Storm. 5-time world mixed martial arts champion, widely considered one of the most technically brilliant fighters in history. Retired undefeated after a 22-year career after an accident that led to the death of my training partner, James, finished Sarah's sentence himself, his voice somber as if an old scar had been touched. The impact of those words hit the room like a bomb. Derek felt his face turn pale as reality dawned on him, cold as a bucket of ice water. He had challenged a living martial arts legend, one of the greatest in history. He had publicly humiliated a man who could have knocked him out with a single casual move, a gentle touch. Five-time world champion. Derek stammered, all his arrogance instantly vanishing, replaced by profound fear and shame. James nodded silently, his eyes distant as if looking into the past. "I retired when I was 29 years old. Since then, I've taken whatever work I could find. Cleaning, maintenance, simple jobs, a simple life. No spotlights, no cameras, no need to prove anything to anyone." The change in Derek was immediate and painful to witness. The arrogant, smug man was gone, replaced by a person who finally understood the depth of his ignorance and his mistake. I didn't know," Derek whispered, his voice barely audible. If you had known, would you have treated me with respect?" James gently interrupted, his eyes looking straight into Derek's, filled with understanding, but also a deep question. "But would you have still humiliated another janitor? A worker who doesn't have a title to defend himself?" That question cut deeper than any physical blow. Derek realized James had hit the root of his real problem. It wasn't his ignorance of James's reputation, but the fundamental arrogance that made him think he could humiliate others based on their profession or social standing. It was a painful but necessary lesson. Sarah stepped forward, her voice firm, without a hint of a tremor. "Sensei Derek, for 2 years I've trained at this academy because I respected your experience. But what I witnessed today was not teaching." She looked directly at Derek, her eyes unwavering. It was bullying disguised as instruction. The other students began to murmur in agreement. The truth about James had completely changed everyone's perspective on what they had just witnessed. They now understood that the truth wasn't always obvious, and arrogance could blind you to many things. "James," Derek finally said, his voice filled with a humility no one there had ever heard before. "I sincerely apologize to you, and I apologize to Sarah." He looked around the room, his eyes full of remorse. "I apologize to everyone here. I have no excuse for my behavior." James nodded, accepting the apology with the same composure he had used to master the physical confrontation. "I appreciate the apology, Derek, but an apology is just the first step. The question is, what will you do differently?" From now on, Derek looked around the room, looking at his students with new eyes, the eyes of a man who had been stripped of his mask of arrogance. Some looked disappointed by his behavior. Others were clearly reevaluating everything they thought they knew about respect and hierarchy. "I will change," Derek promised, his voice more certain, carrying a new determination. "It will take time, but I will change." That's when Sarah asked a question that surprised everyone. A question that could change the future of the entire dojo. "Mr. Washington, would you consider teaching again? Because I think we all could learn more from a man who understands that true power comes with responsibility." James smiled, the first genuine smile anyone had seen from him that night. It was warm and full of hope. Perhaps, but not to teach fighting techniques, but to teach something far more important, that respect isn't earned with belts or titles, but with character. As Derek fully absorbed the most humiliating lesson of his life, a question lingered in the air, a question for all who had witnessed it, and for him personally. Would one night of humility be enough to change decades of arrogance, or would a deeper transformation be required for true justice to be served not just in a fight, but within the man himself? 3 months later, the dojo had completely transformed. James Washington was no longer just the quiet janitor mopping the floor. Sarah Chun, with her persistence and strong conviction, had convinced the gym owner to hire him as a coach specializing in advanced techniques and martial arts philosophy, a valuable addition to the academy. Now James shared his knowledge not with punches, but with meaningful lessons, conveying not only skills, but also the ethics of a fighter. Derek Mitchell lost half of his students in the first week after the incident. The video Sarah had secretly recorded showing a black belt sensei being humiliated by a simple janitor had gone viral online like wildfire. His reputation in the martial arts community was ruined not because he lost the fight, but because of how he behaved. Sensei James Sarah said after a lesson on respect and humility, her voice filled with gratitude. "Thank you for teaching me that true strength doesn't need to be flaunted to be recognized." James smiled, putting away the training equipment. "The best lesson I can teach is very simple. Never judge anyone by their job or their appearance. Every person carries stories that can surprise us, hidden strengths that we can't see with our own eyes." Derek continued to teach at a smaller gym, no longer the center of attention as before. But now he taught with a humility forced upon him by public shame, a costly lesson on the price of arrogance. He had learned that arrogance has a price. Sometimes justice comes quietly, like a storm that changes everything without a sound, leaving behind only purification and unforgettable lessons. James proved that true revenge isn't about destroying your opponent, but about showing that greatness comes from character, not from titles. If this story resonated with you, subscribe to the channel to discover more stories about how extraordinary people turn humiliation into victory and how humility can open the most unexpected doors.